All right, let's move on to our next speaker, our next UNsomniac. We have a Professor of International Politics at the UNSW Canberra, Toni Erskine, who's an award-winning author and leading scholar in international relations and moral and political philosophy. So speaking on a shared responsibility to protect, please welcome Toni Erskine.
Good afternoon, everyone. There's an abundance of issues in contemporary international politics that could, and I think should, keep us awake at night. One that keeps me awake at night is our collective failure to protect vulnerable populations from mass atrocity crimes, from genocide, from ethnic cleansing, from war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This was a problem that the international community was forced to face in July 1995 during the Bosnian War, after 8,000 Muslim Bosniaks, mainly men and boys, were massacred in and around the town of Srebrenica, a town that had been declared a safe haven under UN protection. This is also a problem that the international community confronted the year before that, in 1994 in Rwanda, when 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred in just 100 days. Well, the members of the United Nations deliberated and debated and dithered and failed to act until it was too late. In the wake of both genocides, propelled by waves of guilt and regret and accompanied by numerous apologies, there was a chorus of never again. And yet here we are, again. As 2016 draws to a close, Aleppo in Syria is still under siege. More than 250,000 civilians are currently trapped and under bombardment in East Aleppo. In early October, the UN Special Envoy for Syria compared the situation in Syria to the genocides of the mid-1990s in the Balkans and in Africa. And he stated, and I quote, "The one thing that we are not prepared to do is to remain passive, to resign ourselves to another Srebrenica, another Rwanda." Of course, the political circumstances are very different in Syria, yet the comparison is poignant. Once again, civilians are being killed violently and in large numbers, and we know this is happening. And the members of the international community are either unwilling or unable to act to prevent these atrocities. As was said, my work straddles international relations and moral and political philosophy, and it focuses on questions of which collective bodies in international politics can bear duties or moral responsibilities in the way that we generally understand individual human beings to bear responsibilities. I've argued that formal organizations, including states, transnational corporations like BP, and intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations, are moral agents or bearers of duties in international politics. Now, this can be a controversial claim amongst philosophers, many of whom maintain that only individual human beings, like you and me, can have duties. Yet it seems to cohere with our intuitions about international politics. Politicians and policymakers and people on the street regularly make claims about the specifically moral responsibilities of such collective actors, and indeed blame them for failing to act in particular cases. So who or what has a moral responsibility to protect vulnerable populations when they lack the protection of, or indeed come under threat from, their own governments? Now, someone might respond to my question that it's not a particularly interesting one to ask, and certainly not one to lose any sleep over, as it's already been answered. After all, there's been widespread support for the idea that it's the international community that has a moral responsibility to protect populations from grave human rights abuses. and that this protection may, when necessary, include military intervention. Indeed, all member states of the United Nations unanimously endorsed the responsibility to protect at the 2005 World Summit, where it was made explicit that this responsibility, borne by the international community, must be discharged exclusively by the United Nations. In other words, collectively, we, members of the international community, including Australia, have acknowledged a duty, a moral responsibility to act in cases of mass atrocity. And we've designated an agent of protection to act when states manifestly fail to protect their own populations. And that agent of protection is the United Nations. Yet there are serious problems with assuming that this responsibility to protect lies exclusively with the United Nations. Namely, this designated agent is plagued by both internal and external constraints. The inadequacies in the decision-making structure of the UN Security Council, namely the veto provision, and the UN's reliance on its member states for resources that often aren't forthcoming, mean that the UN is frequently incapable of discharging this espoused responsibility. And this seems to leave us with a rather precarious solution to the problem of protecting vulnerable populations from mass atrocity. About a month ago, UN Humanitarian Chief Stephen O'Brien lamented in the context of the current crisis in Syria that people's lives have been destroyed, and Syria itself has been destroyed. And this is under our collective watch. And it need not be like this. This is not inevitable, and this is not an accident. Addressing the members of the Security Council directly, he continued, and I quote, "There is no question today about whether you, members of this council, know what is going on. You clearly and tragically do. The question today is, what will you do? If you don't act, there will be no Syrian peoples and no Syria to save, and that will be this council's legacy, our generation's shame. If there is a responsibility to protect vulnerable populations from mass atrocity, surely this responsibility doesn't just disappear when the agent that we've designated to discharge it fails to act. So my question is, which alternative body or bodies can be expected to protect vulnerable populations from mass atrocity when the UN is unwilling or unable to act? And this is where things might get a bit controversial. I want to propose so-called coalitions of the willing, or temporary, purpose-driven, self-selected collections of states and sometimes non-state and intergovernmental actors, as one possible and likely provocative answer to this question. But I do so with a great deal of hesitation and worry. Coalitions of the willing have been associated with informal collections of states that engage in military action without UN Security Council authorization or any widely recognized moral imperative to act. And one might think of the infamous example of the coalition of the willing that invaded Iraq in 2003. But I want to propose coalitions of the willing in a different context, for a different purpose, as a way of reconceiving the responsibilities of states and other actors in international politics. In the context of some crises, members of the international community have what we understand to be moral responsibilities, but they may be incapable of acting independently and lack some overarching organization willing or able to act on their behalf. In such cases, it doesn't seem enough to me to concede that nothing can be done, that the responsibility can't be discharged. Drawing on lessons of those philosophers, who work on joint action, we might borrow the insight that when actors come together to work in concert, even in an informal association, they're able to achieve things collectively that they wouldn't be able to achieve when acting alone. We might argue that in the absence of a viable alternative, individual states and possibly other actors have an obligation to establish an informal, temporary association for the purposes of responding to a particular crisis effectively, robustly, and in time to mitigate disaster. And we might rename this group that these actors come together to form a coalition of the obligated. If we're calling on a coalition of the obligated to engage in military intervention for human protection purposes without UN Security Council authorization, then this is a controversial proposal, and rightly so. But it may also be a necessary one if the context is Rwanda in 1994, Srebrenica in 1995, and Aleppo today. Sometimes the organizations that we've created fail, and something still needs to be done. And this seems implicit in the widely endorsed principle that the international community has a moral responsibility to protect. But a few caveats are in order. First, a coalition of the obligated need not be formed solely for the purpose of military intervention. I don't mean that. It may be an informal, temporary association of actors that have come together to deliberate and negotiate and coordinate an effective course of action in order to mitigate some harm, whether that harm be the risk of mass atrocity or climate change. Second, a coalition of the obligated need not be made up only of states, but may be constituted by the range of moral agents or duty bearers in international politics, including states, but also corporations, non-governmental organizations, individual leaders and citizens, and even universities. And finally, none of this is to say that all our obligations are somehow exhausted when such actors come together in an ad hoc group to respond in concert to some crisis, alongside the immediate and the transient imperative to act in concert when faced with a grave crisis that would otherwise be unattended. We also must recognize the medium and the long-term responsibilities to create an environment in which such crises are prevented and to establish or reform formal organizations with the will and the procedures and the resources necessary to act so that such informal, imperfect, and more controversial alternatives simply aren't required. Thank you.